11th, 1995, in Temple, Georgia. Mr. Giles, where and when were you born?
1/20/25, Atlanta, Fulton County, Georgia.
25, okay. Whereabouts in Atlanta?
At the corner of Fair Street and I cannot recall.
Southwest Atlanta.
Right.
Yeah.
About 2 blocks from the old terminal stations where
Okay.
I was born.
Okay. Well, you were a child during the Depression then.
Right.
What was it like in your neighborhood during the Depression?
Tough.
Tough. How come?
Because my dad was legally blind and he couldn't hold a very decent job.
And your mom?
My mother had tuberculosis after I was born, and she stayed on the cure at Battle Hill Sanitarium and Battle Hill out close to Mosley Park at that time, and Alto in Alto, Georgia. And at that time, the only cure they had for TB was rest and diet and a lot of fresh air. And my mother overcome the tuberculosis and lived to be 83 years old.
Who helped take care of you while she had to be away?
My aunts and grandmothers. Believe it or not, I saw 12 grandmothers and 12 grandfathers.
How come?
Well, I'll give you on my dad's side, and I had the same thing on my other side. I saw my daddy's mother and daddy, it's 2, and I saw each one of their mother and daddies, and that's 6. And I saw the same thing on the other side.
Wow, it's a long-lived family.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice to know, isn't it?
Right.
Well, did you get to finish high school?
I quit in 9th grade. I failed English at Joe Brown High, junior high school in 9th grade and quit.
Said the heck with it, huh?
Got married when I was 17.
Wow.
Got drafted when I got drafted on April 22nd after I turned 18 in 1943.
And the Navy was your?
Went in the Navy.
Where did you serve?
I served in the Atlantic Ocean on the destroyer escort.
Okay, and did it see action?
Plenty of action.
Wow. So you were just a baby, and you were seeing action. Were you scared? Or what? Excited?
Well, you're scared for a while and you get over it. It's just routine. We chased submarines. That's what I did in North Atlantic.
Eek.
We escorted huge convoys to England, 200 or 300 ships, and there would be 6 destroyer escorts out front looking for submarines. And when we got a contact, everybody went to battle stations and we dropped depth charges, chased submarines. And I also operated with the USS Wake Island in what they call a killer squadron. The Wake Island was a converted aircraft carrier, and they would put up planes looking for submarines. And I operated with them for 89 days in North Atlantic without seeing land. We took all of our fuel and our groceries from the Wake Island while we was at sea.
Wake Island in the Atlantic.
Yeah, that's the name of the aircraft carrier.
Oh,
Wake
gotcha.
Island.
Okay. Well, give me a start there for a second. Did you ever get on shore?
I had some duty at the receiving station in Philadelphia.
Oh, okay, but not abroad.
No. And I went to the Pacific Ocean and I served on an aviation supply ship. And I went from San Francisco to Guam and operated from Guam to China, 3 trips to China.
You went to China?
Yeah.
Whereabouts? Neat.
Oh, it's interesting. We went to Taku Bar the first time. in the Yellow Sea. And the next time we went in, no, the first time we went to Sang Tao.
Okay.
And the next time we went to Taku Bar, which is all the way north in the Yellow Sea. And we had to anchor out about 40 miles because we was too deep in the water. And they sent out barges for us to unload on.
Did you get to encounter any of the Chinese people?
Yes, we sure did. We got to take a liberty to Sang Tao, China, and we went into Taku Bar and got a truck over to the train station and rode a train into Tientsin. And the Marine Pioneer Division had been over there a year when we got there. And we'd been at sea for a long time. We had a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
We created some inflation while we were over there. We put the Marines out of order.
We might not want to go too closely into the details of that. Maybe I should have said, did you meet any of the country people? But let's just slide over that leave.
Well, the 1st Marine Pioneer Division had the biggest hotel in Tientsin, and their chow hall was in the restaurant in that hotel. That's where we stayed. And the communists was fighting there during the night at that time along the railroads. That was before China went communist in 1946.
So the communists were fighting the Japanese?
Fighting the Chinese.
Oh, okay.
It was internal.
Yeah. Okay. So the war's still going on?
No, the war was over then at that
Okay.
time.
But you stayed in the
With
Navy?
Japan, right.
Okay. And were you married to, let's see, your wife's name is Mrs. Laverne?
No, her name was Wilma Giles.
Oh, different wife?
Right.
Okay. And were you still married to Mrs. Wilma then?
Right.
Okay. And still a young man though?
Yeah, very young.
So anyhow, let's get it past the war, back from China, and back to the States.
Right.
Now, what happened when you got back to the States?
I had to get a job.
And what job did you get?
I was a boiler tender in the Navy aboard ship. So I went to the Georgia Power Company looking for a job to operate a boiler in a powerhouse.
Uh-huh.
And they wasn't hiring anybody in the powerhouse. They sent me to the line department. And I got a job as a helper in the line department.
Oh, okay.
I had a wife and a little boy I had to look at.
Oh, you have a son too. What's his name?
His name is Jimmy, James Alfred Giles.
Okay.
And he was born while I was on my way from Bermuda Island to New York.
Okay. Oh, you got to go to Bermuda too.
Yeah, we went down on a shakedown cruise on a new ship.
What's a shakedown cruise?
Shakedown cruise is where you go to find out all the shortcomings and the physical problems of the ship and get them straightened out before you go to battle.
Oh, you kind of shake it down then.
Shake it down.
All right, yeah. Anyhow, you have a wife and a son, and you become a helper. Now, what did you do as a helper for the Georgia Power Company?
I started digging holes for power company poles.
Did you stick with that job long?
Yeah, 13 years.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, when did you get into ASPE?
Well, while I was working for the Georgia Power Company, I joined the IBEW, and I was active in the IBEW all those years as a member of the executive board and so forth.
Okay,
I'll tell you.
I got confused on which came first.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's slide back to the IBEW then. How did you get interested in how did you come to join the IBEW?
Well, it wasn't optional when I went to work. You had to join within 6 months or you didn't have a job. That was before the Taft-Hartley.
Okay. And so you join up, and are you glad to?
Yeah.
Okay. Was Atlanta a comfortable place for union men then?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Would you call it a union town?
Not hardly.
Not hardly, all right. What were people thinking about, your neighbors say, or your church congregation people thinking about unions at that time? If you had to make a generalization.
Well, I wasn't bashful about letting anybody know I was a member of the union and active in the union, and including my minister or anybody else.
Mhm. Well, did you find a good response or kind of hostile
Well,
or what?
Sort of mediocre,
Yeah. Like you're in a union, so what?
yeah.
Oh, well, hey, that's not so bad. Considering some of the stuff people did, that's not so bad. What made you decide to get active in the union, and how did that come about?
It was real simple. There was a bunch of GIs working for the power company in the line department, about 400 of us under one roof. Every morning we'd go into our locker rooms and get ready to go out on trucks to the jobs. And there was a bunch of those old 4F bastards that stayed there, and as foreman, it had made foreman that was using bad language talking to some of us employees. And I said, something needs to be done about that. So I started attending the union meetings. I served my apprenticeship. I sat on the back row and listened to the procedures and the issues, and finally I started running my mouth and participating in the discussions and debates.
And did you become a steward?
Yes, I was a steward.
Okay. What did you do as a steward?
I tried to look after our members.
Yeah. Did you take on the 4F fellows?
Well, not really in that capacity, but that's what motivated me to get active in the union, was the way we was being treated. We had a sweetheart arrangement between the union and the company, and I didn't like it, and I thought it needed to be changed, and I worked towards that end, and I changed a lot of it before I left.
Why don't you tell me about that? Tell me about some of the highlights looking back on changing it. Wait a minute. Let's go back to your childhood first. Would you tell me some more since I've rushed you ahead?
Okay, I want to point out that my dad was blind, legally blind, but he could see to get around. And during the Depression, there was 15 million men, big, healthy, strapping men out of work. My dad didn't have a job, and the city of Atlanta was broke, paying their employees with script, whatever that is. That's my understanding. And they couldn't hire enough police to keep people from stealing everything that wasn't nailed down. My daddy went to the city of Atlanta and got a permit to carry a gun. He bought an old 38 owl head pistol and went to the corner of Edgewood Avenue and Boulevard and signed up the junkyards and the grocery stores and drugstores and all the shops in that area, and all of them together was paying him about $12 a week to spend from sundown to sunup guarding the stuff in that area. And that's the way my dad made a living and made a job for himself during that time.
They hired him even though he was legally blind.
He could see to get around. He could see what was going on, but he couldn't read and couldn't write.
And I guess they figured at nighttime anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
But he kept the people from stealing the
Yeah.
stuff anyway.
Yeah. What were you doing? Tell me more about what you were doing as a kid.
I was playing as much as I could.
What did you play at?
In and everywhere.
Remember any special games?
Not really.
No, that's kind of,
I spent a lot of time in the country when school was out. My grandparents lived in the country, and I loved the country. And that's where I went when school was out and stayed until school started again.
Where were they living?
Well, my mother's daddy lived in Paulding County near Hiram, Georgia, and he was a truck farmer, and I pulled my first strike working for him.
What'd you do?
Well, I'd been carrying seed to the planters and guiana to the distributors, and chopping cotton and hoeing cotton and putting soda around corn, and he had 14 acres of watermelons. And he told us when we got through laying by the watermelons, we laid by for a while. We was going to quit for a while. And the vines had already started growing, and I had to turn those vines parallel with the road where they could ply up close to them, and then go back and straighten them out. And there's a lot of hills of watermelons in 14 acres. And he said we'd be done when we got through, so that evening, it was about 3 o'clock, we got done. I got me a can, went and dug me some worms and fixed me a fishing pole, and it rained that night, and I was going fishing next morning. Granddaddy got up from the breakfast table and he said, J.W., when you get through, you get that old Scoville hoe, we're going to sprout the new ground. Well, it wasn't but one Scoville hoe, so I knew what we meant. And I didn't get to go fishing, but I didn't sprout the new ground. There's an old man down the road that ran a rolling store, and he went to Atlanta on Friday and traded all of his chickens and eggs and butter for his supplies. And it was Friday, and I knew he was going to Atlanta. So I got my other pair of overalls, and I went to Atlanta. I didn't get to go fishing, but I didn't sprout the new ground.
You ran away from home. Did you get in trouble?
No. And I gotta get on the record about my great-grandpa Giles that lived in Billart, Douglas County, Georgia. When he was 15 years old at the Mud Hole School in Douglas County, Georgia, the Confederate Army sent a lieutenant around looking for boys big enough to go in service. And they was going to let him take him and put him in the service, wasn't even going to let him go home and tell his mother and dad. And he ran away, got away from them. Next year he joined the Confederate Army, and he was in the Battle of New Hope at Dallas, Georgia. And that statement I just made is in the history of Douglas County book.
And he survived the war?
And he was the last living survivor of the Confederate War in Douglas County. He attended the last convention of the Confederate soldiers in Dallas, Texas, in about 1935 or 36, before he died in 1937. And I was 12 years old. I used to sit on his knee and he'd tell me about being in that war.
You must have been proud of him.
I was.
Yeah. That's heavy stuff for a 12-year-old, too.
Yeah.
Well, let's see now. You get up to being about age 13, must have been when you started high school. Hmm? About that?
Somewhere in that
Somewhere.
neighborhood, yeah.
And it was Brown High School?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden, you say, the heck with this noise, and you dropped out and then got married.
Yeah, and I was a soda jerk for Merritt and Weldon Pharmacy in East Point, and for Howell's Pharmacy at the corner of People Street and Gordon Street in West End, and I made sandwiches at the Varsity and packed ice cream at the Varsity, and was very close to old man Gordy, and before he died, he looked just like he did in 1942.
Do me a favor and tell me, just for my kids, because they're big Varsity fans, what was the Varsity like then?
Oh, it was humongous.
Mm-hmm.
The parking lot went out there where I-75 and 85 is now.
Wow.
All of that was Varsity parking lot. And I was told, the story goes, that Mr. Gordy was a student at Georgia Tech. And he flunked out. And he said, I'm going up the street and make $1 million. And he did.
And what's more is he did it by poisoning Georgia Tech students.
The what?
He did it by poisoning Georgia Tech students too. No, just kidding. I'm kind of a varsity fan myself. At least once a year I gotta go. Is it true that you used to that people used to bring food out to them on roller skates?
No,
Remember?
I don't.
Oh,
I don't
okay.
remember the roller skates.
Okay, that's just a fantasy then.
I remember Flossie, who was a curb boy that could sing the menu to all the customers.
Wow.
He was there for years and years.
And he sang the menu to people?
Yes.
Where did you and your wife live?
We lived on York Street in West End to start with.
So you got out on your own right away?
That's what my mother told me when I told her I was going to get married. She said, where are you going to take her? You're not going to bring her here. A lot different it is this day and time.
Well, did you want to add some other things about your childhood?
Oh, I guess that's all.
Because I think that we have to call you an adult once you get married.
Yes.
And especially once you get into the service.
Right.
How do you think the service changed you?
It made me grow up pretty fast.
Yeah. Did you feel like you were a different person when you came back, or a fuller person?
I think I probably wound up doing a lot of things in my life that I wouldn't have done if I hadn't been in the service.
Oh, boy, you read my mind. I was going to ask, well, what kind of things?
Well, running around with women and stuff like that.
Oh, well, all right. That wasn't quite what I was going to ask. I was going to say, do you think that being in the service maybe tilted you towards being an activist in later life, or affected you in any way in terms of your career or your labor involvement?
Well, one thing you learn in the service is you learn to follow orders.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't learn anything else, you learn to follow orders.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that. The reason is everybody's life's depending on whoever's in charge. And so, somebody's got to make the decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And
Is that a lesson that carried over, then you think?
well, one thing about the service, when I used to go to the movies and I'd see the sailors looking out the porthole at the hula girls in Honolulu, they never did tell me that who was going to be washing my clothes and making up my bunk and that sort of stuff. They didn't tell me that I'd be washing my own clothes. They didn't put that in the movie.
No, they don't. Mm-hmm. Well, were you joking about the women's stuff?
Well, no, because we was living hard and living fast, and we didn't know when we was going to be living and when we was going to be dead. So we decided we'd just go on and live a little bit.
Yeah, so it was a girl in every port?
Not hardly, I wouldn't say that. Every chance I got.
Okay, that's a little different. Well, you were young. When you got back to the States and went to work for Georgia Power, where were you living then in Atlanta? Do you remember?
I was living at the corner of White Street and Lee Street,
Okay.
West End, about 2 blocks from the old farmer's market
Okay.
on Sylvan Road.
And not so far from where you grew up, huh?
That's right.
And were you living there with your first wife and son?
Right.
Okay. Well, okay, well, you're at Georgia Power. Who are your mentors in these early years?
Well, E.J. Slim Lord from Gainesville, Georgia, was a lineman for the Georgia Power Company in Atlanta, and he's the man that I apprenticed with, and a man that I have a lot of respect for. And one of the foremen that I worked with was deeply involved in the strike of the local Union 84 IBEW from 31 to 36. The strike lasted almost 5 years. And W.L. Chapman was one of the many men that was involved in that strike. And he had some strong convictions about the Union, and he was a big inspiration to me in my Union activities. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to pay special tribute to L.W. Luther Boren and Walter Fairchild for their strong support for me to run for full-time business manager and financial secretary of local Union 84 IBEW.
What kind of men were those last two men? Were they also big union men?
They were good union men. They wasn't that active, but they believed in the union and what the union stood for, and they stood behind what the union was standing for at that time.
Sounds like they believed in you too.
Well, I would like to say this, that when they started that strike in 1931, the unions didn't have good procedures back then, and people just went to a regular union meeting one night and they was pissed off about something and they didn't like what was going on. They decided they'd strike. They didn't give any notice and didn't give the other people a chance to be there and participate in the discussion and debate and the vote. And that's the reason it wound up part of the men working the strike. Because they didn't have an opportunity to vote, which is bad procedures. You need better procedures than that in the union, and we have them today, thank goodness.
Were you involved in any strikes yourself?
No, not with the Georgia Power Company.
Okay. Negotiations?
All the negotiations for, I was on the negotiating committee several years before I got to be a full-time union representative.
So you must have been a successful negotiator if there weren't the strikes then. Do any of them stand out in your mind?
Well, one of the main reasons we didn't strike was because we had a continuance clause in our contract, and instead of the contract expiring on a given date and just being out without a contract after that date, the contract had a provision that said the contract would remain in force and effect until a new agreement was reached. Mm-hmm. Therefore, we went beyond the expiration date a lot of times in our negotiations. And we always got, our wage increases were retroactive back to the expiration date of the contract.
Very nice.
So that saved a lot of strikes. And the IBEW has one of the best arrangements with its outside contractors, which local Union 84 dealt with too. Has a Council of Industrial Relations, they call it. It's one of the best arrangements of the entire labor movement.
What makes it so good?
Well, when they reach an impasse in negotiations, either party reserves the right to take the issues to the Council of Industrial Relations. And the Council of Industrial Relations is made up of equal representatives from the Contractors Associations and from the IBEW. And they resolve the issues, and their decision is final and binding on both parties. And that organization has saved the industry millions of hours and strikes.
Do they do this because say, Georgia Power or other?
Georgia Power Company don't have anything to do with it. It's just between the electrical contractors and the IBED.
Okay.
But Local Union 84 also, in addition to the utility jurisdiction, it also had jurisdiction over outside construction,
I understand that.
which dealt with the Council of Industrial Relations.
Okay.
And I never did have a case. I negotiated the first outside agreement Local Union 84 ever had with outside contractors. And the reason I found out later that we got the agreement, the contractor from Hinkles and McCoy from Indiana, Muncie, Indiana, they was going to break down our working conditions by gloving a higher voltage than what we was accustomed to gloving. And much to their surprise, they couldn't get any of the IBEW members to do what they wanted to do, so they wasn't able to break down our conditions. The Georgia Power Company attempted to do that while I was business manager, and they wasn't successful at it.
Well, what is that? What is gloving higher voltage?
Well, you put on rubber gloves up to your elbow, and then you got a leather glove that goes over top of that. At that time, we gloved up to and including 2,300 volts phase to ground, or what they call 4160 phase to phase. If you put one hand on one phase and one hand on the other phase, you had 4160 between them. But from phase to ground, it's just 2,300 volts, but that'll kill you too. But 12,000 volts, they had taught us all the time we was working there that it was unsafe to work 12,000 volts. And then all of a sudden, because the 12,000 volt system was much more efficient than the 2,300 volt system, and they could feed further away from the stations, and they was converting their system from 2,300 to 12,000. At that time, we worked all of that voltage with sticks. We did all the work with sticks, didn't put our hands on it, or either we killed it and ground it, de-energized it and ground it.
And so all of a sudden, Shazam, it was safe then, right?
Yeah, all of a sudden.
It's like a miracle.
And they was getting geared up to do that, and I arranged to get a lot of the linemen to bring their wives, and I got some movies from Georgia Tech and different places that showed the arc in electricity and how bad and how dangerous it was, and I had the support of the people, and they didn't do it as long as I was there. At one time when we was in negotiations, they offered us a whole $100 more a month if we just gloved that voltage. And we told them $100 didn't make it any safer. And they didn't work it.
It doesn't pay for the tombstone, I'll tell you.
But they're working it today after I left. They're working it.
I want to ask you in a little while about what your opinion is of the labor movement today. But first, let's just get on record just exactly what your positions in the IBEW were. Now, you started as a steward, and then you moved on from there.
I was on the executive board for several terms. I was vice president of the local union for one term. I was president for one term. I was business manager for 3 terms, 3 two-year terms, and then I was kicked out of office in 1965 for being under the influence in negotiations. But I didn't do anything any different than the international representative did that was sitting in on those negotiations. We went out to lunch and we had some martinis, and we got back and I just happened to cuss somebody out, and they didn't like me anyway. The international didn't like me because I was too popular. I didn't have no trouble having the support of people, and they didn't like it. And I go to the district meetings and the district council. All of the companies that was on the Southern Company property, all of the unions that was on the Southern Company property, we had a joint council we called Southeastern System Council, and we had quarterly meetings or semi-annual meetings or special meetings, whatever it took to keep everybody informed of what was going on the Southern Company system. And when I talked at those meetings, I had the support of the people wherever I was at. I went to 6 international conventions of the IBEW, I remember. And one of them was in St. Louis in 1965, and I got the local union to go on record to oppose a $6.40 increase in dues at one time that they was trying to ram down our throat, to support a $50 a month pension that somebody had reached up in the air 20 years before that and picked out a figure and said, this is what we're going to pay for it and this is what we're going to pay out. And they didn't do any actuarial studies, and we was going to subsidize all them old people that had gone on before us that didn't pay for their pension plan. So my members instructed me to go there and oppose it. And I opposed it. And I talked against it, and when they put it to a vote, it lost. There was a yea and nay vote, and it lost, but the chair ruled that it passed. And I challenged the chair, and they had a standing vote. And it was obvious that lost, but he sent his sergeants at arms out, and they counted, and they come back and tallied up, and he said that it passed. Well, I called for a roll call vote. And all these other things I did, I was identified in the proceedings, in the convention proceedings. But when I called for a roll call vote, it says an unidentified delegate called for a roll call vote. And they adjourned the convention right then. And they got their house in order that night. And the next day on the roll call, it passed. But I talked more times at that convention. If you looked in the back end of the convention proceedings, by every delegate that spoke, it's got the page number that he spoke on. And I talked more times than the president did.
Winning friends and influencing people wherever you
They
go.
didn't like me.
No.
So they kicked me out of office. Then after that, they got real concerned about people who work for the power company. And they got the power companies to agree to an employees assistance program. But the International didn't have no damn employee assistance program for me.
All right, let's go back before 65 now. Because it sounds like you've met some memorable people that you'd like to punch out and some memorable people otherwise. Why don't you tell me about some of the people that you remember, good and bad?
Well, to start with, the vice president of the IBEW was a guy named G.H. Parker. He had a coin collection that was worth about $1 million. Back then, $1 million was a pile of money, sure enough, in those days.
Does he have an unmarried son?
And I'm not going to speculate how he got all that money.
I guess that he wasn't one of the ones that you remember fondly.
He's one of the ones that helped kick me out of office. He and a guy named J.V. Pate, who was a thief from Macon, Georgia.
Okay. You mean literally a thief?
Well, they tell me that he was, when he worked with his tools at Warner Robins, he was caught thieving before he got to be business manager local 1316 in Macon.
Boy. Okay. How about good memories of folks? I'll ask the question this way, because that's a real general question. If you had to pick out a time that you said, I'm so proud of that moment that I'd live it again, what would you pick out?
Well, it would probably be when after I had been working for ASME, and after I had been Secretary of State AFL-CIO, I went back to work for Local 84 as an assistant business manager when I lost the position, when I lost the election for president of State AFL-CIO. I went back to work as an assistant for Clyde Connor in 71 and 72. At that time, the William Steiger Act, later known as OSHA, was under consideration in the Congress. And having always been concerned about safety, I was sort of up to speed on what was going on about my trade and my industry. And when they come out with their proposed standards in the Federal Register, I got a copy of it. And I went through the proposed standards, and I wrote up a bunch of proposed standards myself. And I went around the city of Atlanta taking pictures of the old type construction they used to have a long time ago, and 8 or 10 photographs of the new type construction with everything congested, which was much unsafer than what we'd been accustomed to. But it was more economical for construction and more economical for maintenance. So that's what they adopted. So they had public hearings in Washington. I made slides from those 8 or 10 photographs, and I had a canister of slides and my prepared remarks to present at the public hearing. And there was safety men from utility companies all over the country at that hearing. And there was also some union people from all over the country at that hearing. And when I got through with my presentation at that hearing, the union people jumped up and clapped, and the union management people got carried away and jumped up and clapped too. So that was one of my most memorable moments,
yeah,
yes.
That's a proud moment. You bet. After 65, let's just get it in order. Where you went right after 65, and you lose the election. What do you do then?
I didn't lose the election. I was just re-elected. I had just been re-elected in July, and they removed me from office.
Oh, I thought they rigged the election or something.
No, they had a trial and had some of my good brothers come up and preferred charges against me because I took a drink of liquor. And they took me out of office and handpicked a guy to put in my place that had been giving me hell for 2 years. He was going with my secretary. My secretary was furnishing him a copy of my report before every meeting, and he was holding a rump meeting with my executive board, and they come to the regular meeting prepared to vote against everything that I had proposed, and they did. Instead of me reading off a page or two and saying in the executive board report, and we vote to concur with the executive board's report, like they had always done, I had to fight them on every damn issue at the union meeting. But I won every issue for 2 years. That guy couldn't beat me on nothing. And that's one of the reasons they kicked me out of office.
That's why you got framed up, yeah.
Yeah, I got framed up.
Look on. Bet you didn't think much of that secretary.
And
didn't keep her on, I bet.
And he fired her later on too.
No joke.
Yeah.
Oh, what was his name?
Amos Lowry.
Amos Lowry. Okay. I gotta make a mental note. Never work for this man. Well, okay. So you got kicked out, and then what did you do?
I went to work with my tools, working with a contractor.
Okay. And how long did that last?
Oh, about 6 or 8 months. State county municipal employees come looking me up and wanted me to go to work for them.
Ask me.
Asked me.
Okay, and what'd you go to work for them as?
organizing.
Why don't you tell me a little about what it was like to organize for ASME?
That was interesting.
Yeah?
It was real interesting.
Okay. Give me a typical example of organizing.
Well, the union already had some sort of recognition from the city of Atlanta. They could go to the personnel meeting with grievances. If somebody had been done wrong, they could take a grievance to the personnel board, and sometimes they could get some things straightened out. But you know, the laws don't cover state, county, and municipal employees. They are exempt specifically.
Yeah.
And the only way the state, county, municipal employees union can get anywhere is with muscle and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
One of the first things I did when I went with ASME was get them to adopt some procedures for going on strike. Got them revised their bylaws and updated them to establish some procedures. And after I got to be director of District Council 14, somebody decided that they was going to make the city of Atlanta grant a wage increase that was already promised and the city was already committed to on January the 1st of the following year. But about August or September or somewhere thereabouts, somebody decided that they was going to make the city of Atlanta pay that wage increase then.
Oh.
And that's when the Wildcat strike occurred.
Okay, tell me about that.
Now, there was a guy named John Kissick from the Textile Workers Union from North Carolina who was living in a motel on Cheshire Bridge Road close to the headquarters of the Cheshire Bridge Road Sanitation Department. And one morning about 9 o'clock, the city of Atlanta called me and told me they had a strike at the Cheshire Bridge headquarters. And I called the superintendent of sanitation. I can't recall his name at this time, but it was under the Ivan Allen administration in 1968. And asked him to meet me out there. And he did. And I went in the locker room where all those people were, and there were some of them already well under the influence. And I got up on the bench and told them that you're on an illegal, unauthorized wildcat strike. You're in violation of your own rules and regulations. And I urge you to get on those trucks and go to work. If you don't, I'm going to urge this man standing beside me here to fire you. And it was apparent to me that the strike was going to spread, so I got on television with John Pruitt and made the same statement on television. Mm-hmm. Well, the International Union got hold of it and they didn't like it, so they sent their hatchet man, a guy named Shapiro, to Atlanta. And he was going to take over my union. And I said, no, you're not going to take over the union. And I was meeting with the city of Atlanta. I said, you can stay in on any meeting that I'm in, but I'm the director of District Council 14 in accordance with the Constitution of this union. I said, unless and until you put it under trusteeship and remove me from office, I'm in charge and you can take a back seat. So I run the meetings dealing with the city of Atlanta. And I can't remember the exact sequence of all this, but and I want to put it in a record that we had a secretary in this union named Mildred Clack, and she had at one time been a secretary for the Machinists International Union, and she also knew John Kissick, and she knew that he was in town and that he was out there at that motel and that he was engaged in some activities with that group of people. So in the meetings with the city of Atlanta, after we'd been meeting almost a week, it come time for these people to get their payday, and they was on strike. And a couple of them that was on the committee decided they'd come over on my side. They'd been on Shapiro's side. I said, well, you know, y'all, they don't pay people while they're on strike. I said, now, if you want to go back to work, I might can make some arrangements to get the city of Atlanta to pay you while you've been on strike. So they thought they could sell it. So I met with Ivan Allen, and they was considering it. And there was a guy on the city council, there was a guy on the city council, they called him alderman at that time, I think, named G. Everett Milligan. He was the vice president of Gulf Oil Company. He was fixing to run for mayor. And he wanted the support of the black community to get elected mayor. So instead of dealing with me and the union and letting the union decide in a union meeting what to do, he goes and gets with Jose Williams. And Jose Williams calls a meeting of the ASME members at a black church on Boulevard. And the news media was there. I didn't go because it wasn't a union meeting. That was Jose's meeting. And at the news, 11 o'clock news that night, Jose said, if y'all vote to accept what the city is offering to pay you while you're on strike, I'm with you. And if you vote to reject it, I'm with you. So they voted to reject it. Well, the next morning, I figured out what was going on. I went to Channel 5. I had presidents of all 5 city local unions, and I was going to make a news release to Channel 5 about what G. Everett Milligan was doing. Well, when I got to that part in the story on the release, they cut the camera off and said, we'll be back in a little bit. They stopped right there. He was part of the establishment, G. Everett Milligan. They went and called G. Everett Milligan. He calls Jose Williams. The city of Atlanta takes the city trucks and goes to the picket lines, picks up the pickets, carries them to the same church on Boulevard, and they vote to accept the same thing they'd rejected the night before, making my news release no longer newsworthy. So that's the reason I'm putting this in the record.
Some of the guns.
That's exactly what happened.
But Milligan never became mayor.
And Milligan didn't come mayor, and Shapiro never did put that local union under trusteeship. I was still director of District Council 14 when I got elected to Secretary of the State AFL-CIO about a month or two later, but I got out just in time. They was after me.
But the good guys won for a while.
Yeah.
Well, let's go. Well, wait a minute. Before I go on to the state AFL-CIO, I have heard that ASME is a little quick to put unions, local unions, under trusteeship or receivership. Is that a fact?
They wasn't while I was there. I went to one of their board meetings in New Orleans, and I made my case. I had two huge 3-ring binders about everything that transpired, and I pointed my finger in Jerry Worth's face and told him that he had authority under that Constitution to put that organization under trusteeship, and until then I was director of District Council 14. And I was a delegate to his international union in Miami, and it was about this time of year, and they had a hurricane named Abigail. And his wife, Jerry Worth's wife, gave birth to a baby girl in New York, and they named that baby Abigail. And that day, Hubert Humphrey addressed our convention, and I had my picture taken with him. My ex-wife has got it, and I'd give anything for it to put it in the Labor Archives.
Is she still?
She lives in Rex, Georgia. And the labor movement really screwed up when they failed to elect Hubert Horatio Humphrey as President of the United States. And I've been told, and I have good reason to believe, that the Teamsters and the Auto Workers Union supported Richard Milhouse Nixon so they could have a key to the back door of the White House.
The Teamsters I can believe, but the auto workers too, huh?
That's what I understand.
Is that right? Very interesting.
And we could elect Humphrey.
Yeah.
And the next day, Robert Kennedy got killed while I was at that convention.
Were you a supporter of Robert Kennedy's also?
I would have supported either one of them. Either one of them that got the nomination, they'd had my all-out support.
Mr. Giles, are you a yellow dog Democrat?
I don't know what a yellow dog Democrat is.
You'd vote for a yellow dog that was running on the Democratic ticket.
I reckon I am.
Yeah.
I hadn't seen any, but the closest thing that I ever seen that I might have could have voted for would have been George Bush. I never have understood how people voted for Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
He was a Democrat to start with, and what was they said about him? He was a Teflon president.
Yeah.
And you can tell his supporters about all the money he spent for his friends in the defense industry. And he spent more money as president than all the other presidents put together. Got us more in debt than all the rest of the presidents put together. And they talk about the Democrats doing it. For the record, I started attending union meetings in the Labor Temple adjacent to the Atlanta City Hall parking lot. The Labor Temple was a 2-story building facing Trinity Avenue. The temple was once described as one of the first labor temples in the United States.
Is that right? And what did it look like?
It was a nice looking building, and you walk in the front door, it had wide steps going to the second story, right in front of the front door. Boy, we had some raunchy union meetings in them days.
Like what? I'm kind of scared of the answer.
Well, I won't go into that.
All right, we'll just slide by that one. Well, why did they get rid of the Labor Temple and build a new IBEW building?
Well, I can tell you the story behind that if you want to know.
Yeah, I do.
I was a delegate to the Atlanta Labor Temple Association from Local Union 84.
Okay.
As a delegate to the Atlanta Labor Temple Association, the Labor Temple at that time was at 250 10th Street. Never had adequate parking around that facility for any meeting of any size. And we was always looking for something different. I was. At that time, there was a boys' club just south of the Capitol between Central Avenue and the Expressway. And the property was going to be for sale. And I advocated before the Labor Temple Association that the Labor Temple Association inquire about that property. And then we built a new Labor Temple in that area so it would be close to the Capitol and convenient. Well, the Labor Temple Association got somebody to look into the possibilities of getting the land, and they got somebody, an architect, to do the plans that the IBEW building has got. The Labor Temple Association opted not to do anything. The IBEW Local 613 took the ball and went and bought the land and built a building. And my statement can be substantiated, if I'm not mistaken. It's in the record in the Atlanta Labor Council proceedings.
And that's why it's the IBEW building.
Right.
Yeah. You know, I often wondered about
But
that.
that was my idea.
Now, we were bopping along. You had gone out on your own. You had been in ASME. And I think we last left you shaking your fist in Jerry Worth's face. What year was that Wildcat, or that sort of Wildcat? Kind of a half Wildcat, I guess you'd call it.
It was 1968, the same year that Martin Luther King got killed. In fact, just prior to the time Martin Luther King got killed, he was walking a picket line at the Scripto plant on Boulevard, and I was walking on the picket line right behind him.
Did you meet him then?
Yeah, I knew Martin Luther King. And that's what he was doing in Memphis. He was in Memphis on the ASME business.
Yeah, with the sanitation.
Sanitation workers of ASME.
What sort of guy was he?
He was a deeply religious man. He had strong convictions, as everybody knew.
It's very interesting you should say that.
Well, let me tell you another little story about the IBEW and black people. The CIO attempted to organize the underground department of the Georgia Power Company, of which was the laborers was all black people. At that time, the underground department, Georgia Power Company, when they went to build an extension to an underground line, they would dig a manhole. And then these black men would tunnel under the ground from one hole to the next and build the shoring for it. The Georgia Power Company didn't want to deal with the CIO because they was a militant organization. And they made sweetheart arrangements with G.X. Barker. And the IBEW amended Local Union 84's charter so they would take BA members, what they call BA members. That's a non-beneficial member. Used to be primarily people in the manufacturing industry was BA members. Construction type people was A members. Now that's the beneficial members where you get a pension from the IBEW. But the IBEW won out and took those people in. And at the time I was elected business manager, the black people had always been holding their meetings for black people at the Butler Street YMCA. I attended some of those meetings when I was president of the local union.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was elected business manager, I did away with the meeting. I told them if they wanted to come to a union meeting, they'd come 250 10th Street like everybody else.
Oh.
And the first meeting that they attended was a contract. We was voting on the contract, and it was a big meeting. And the president of the local union at that time was a guy named Paul Champion. And when they started, and the meeting hall was already full of people sitting in the windows and on radiators and everywhere else. And when they come in, he was fixing to order them out. And I got up and stopped him. And they come in and sat down. And we had one or two instances after that. One time some of them come in a meeting one night, and the guy went down this is at 250 10th Street. He went down the hall to a janitor's room and got a bottle of Clorox or something and slipped in the back door and poured it under the seat where some of them guys were sitting. Raunchy. The Georgia Power Company also had a separate insurance plan for their black employees. Black employees wasn't entitled to the same benefits as white employees was. And I'm the guy that brought the Georgia Power Company to the bargaining table on insurance and pension. Up until that time, they had been taking our insurance premiums, and at the end of every year, they'd check with the Provident Insurance Company in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which there was probably some member of the Georgia Power Company's executives that was on the board of directors of Provident Insurance Company, if you got checked into it. They'd come around. We had an insurance plan, a hospitalization program that paid so much for such and such operation, so much a day for a room, and so forth. Well, at the end of the year, they'd be real charitable. They'd come around and they'd say, well, we're going to add another $1 a day to your insurance for your room rent.
Mm-hmm.
Or we're going to add a $10 a day coverage on an appendectomy or something like that. And the Steelworkers Union took the United States Steel to Supreme Court over insurance being a proper subject for collective bargaining, and they won. And when they did, I took them to the bargaining table. They come too.
They must have been sweating too.
Well, we never was that successful in making all of the dramatic changes that we'd like to make, but at least we got them to bargain on the issue. And we also got them to bargain on pension. They'd always contended that was their pension program. They paid for it exclusively, but we were running like we pleased. But we changed that in my administration.
Are you getting a pension now?
No, when I got kicked out of office, if I'd have went back and worked for the power company one day and bridged my time, I'd have had vested rights. But I was too damn hard-headed. I wouldn't have given them the satisfaction of working me one day. So I don't have a pension from them. I collect $84 a month from the IVEW that I bought and paid for myself, and $988 from the Social Security. That's all I get.
Would you consider yourself a hard-headed man still today?
I still consider myself hard-headed and proud of it.
It seems it's almost silly to ask you this after what you were just saying, but let's get it on the record. How did you feel about the civil rights movement when it came along, as a labor person?
Well, I can answer that. I was going to tell you that. I had that in my notes. Before I was elected business manager at Local Union 84, the Atlanta Labor Council was petitioning the United Appeal to put on a labor liaison person. And before the AFL-CIO merged, there was an IBEW guy that was in charge of the AFL's program. He was labor liaison between the AFL and United Appeal nationally. Well, he heard about my interest in that job, and he called me and told me some things to do if I wanted to apply for that job. One of them was to take a course in public speaking, and I went to oh goodness, I can't think of the name of that old school. It was an old high school on Whitehall Street.
I'll look it up and I'll put it in brackets.
But the instructor's name was a guy named Morris, and he said the first night we attended, he said, I want each one of you to come prepared to make a 5-minute talk next meeting. And that was the subject that I chose to speak on, was immigration.
What'd you say about it?
I had a wife and a little boy and 2 little girls at that time. And
Are we up to Mrs.
having been a veteran and having served with some black people in the service, and having seen how they was treated in the service, and having grown up in the city of Atlanta, I spoke along those lines in that meeting. I said, how can you tell a man to go fight for his country and then come home and tell his kids that you can't use this water fountain and you can't use this restroom, you can't go in this restaurant? But yet, son, when you get 18, you gotta go fight for your country too. I said my granddaddy'd probably turn over in his grave if he heard what I had to say, but that was my convictions and what I had to say at that time.
And you never know, your granddaddy might have thought it was a good idea too.
Could have.
The response must have been one of shock from a lot of people.
Including my wife and kids.
Is that right? How old were your kids then?
I don't know. We was living on Oak Avenue. My boy was probably 14. And my daughter's was probably 6 and 8, something like that. I lost one between there with leukemia.
So sorry. Are we on Mrs. Laverne yet? Or?
No,
Okay.
that happened a long time after that. That happened 21 years ago.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about the changes that the civil rights movement created in Atlanta? I should, let me rephrase it. Do you think the civil rights movement created changes in Atlanta?
I won't have to be honest with you now. I spoke to tell you real frankly about what my convictions were at that time. But there's been some things happen that's transpired that just about turned me back the other way.
Mm-hmm. So, do you think that's connected to the civil rights movement?
I think that there's a lot of people in that organization that's just carrying things absolutely too far. I mean, they're trying to imply that all us honkies are responsible for all their damn trials and tribulations, and that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of people in this country that didn't ever have any relatives that had any slaves. And as far as I know, I'm one of them. And I'm not responsible for holding them back.
When do you think that turned around?
I don't know. It's I think some of those people are doing their own people a great disservice by continually. I mean, they're teaching their young black kids. They're leaving with them with the impression that all these good things that you see on TV that all these other people's got, you could have had it too if you'd been treated right. And hell, just go out and take it. If you ain't got it, go get it. Just go on and get it. And that's the impression they're leaving them with.
Hang on. Let's get back to that public speaking that you were telling me about.
Okay, Bob Flaherty encouraged me to take a course in public speaking and told me about several books that I should read and things I should do if I was interested in applying for that job with the United Appeal as a labor liaison, all of which I complied with. At that time, I was a delegate to the Atlanta Labor Council. That was just before I was fixing to run for business manager of Local 84 in 1959. The president of the Atlanta Labor Council at that time was a guy named Jim Moore. He was also president of the state and secretary of the state AFL-CIO at that time. And a fellow named Charlie Mathias was supporting a guy named Jesse Lester as the labor liaison for the United Appeal. And Charlie was a pretty influential person in the city of Atlanta. And a night or two before nominations in my local union, Jim Moore took me back to his office and showed me a bunch of what was supposed to have been airmail letters to all of the correspondence he had trying to promote me as labor liaison with the United Appeal. He said, now if you run for business manager, you're not going to be able to get that job. And I looked at him and I said, Jim, I don't fool with your damn local union politics, and you don't fool with my damn local union politics. What I run for hasn't got nothing to do with my application with United Appeal. And if I'd have listened to him, I'd have been sitting outside. The guy who was business manager in my local union would have been reelected, and Jesse Lester would have got the job with United Appeal. And wasn't long after Jesse Lester got the job with United Appeal, I was business manager and still a delegate to the Atlanta Labor Council. And Jesse Lester was taking sides on issues in debate in the council meeting. And I took Jesse Lester aside and I said, look, I said, you're the labor liaison for all the people in all the organizations in this body. And I said, you ain't got no damn business taking positions on nobody, on none of the issues in debate in this organization. I said, if you do, you're not going to get the support of the people in this labor movement. And he wised up and he got off of that position. He was just a puppet in Charlie Mathias's hands. And Charlie Mathias one time promised Ivan Allen that he had labor's endorsement for mayor. And he got up and said so in the Atlanta Labor Council meeting. And I got up and said, damn, if that's so, you don't promise somebody that we're going to support them without a vote of this body. And we're going to support Charlie Brown. And the council went on record to support Charlie Brown. We didn't get him elected, but Charlie Mathias didn't promise the support of organized labor.
While we're on the Atlanta Labor Council, let me just ask you, how did it work then? I mean, how did it break down? I know how it works formally, more or less. Tell me the dirt on the Atlanta Labor Council is what I'm trying to say.
I don't know about that.
No. You want to just skip over that part for a while?
Uh, no, I don't want to comment about
All
that.
right, let's draw that curtain then.
I want to talk about a fellow named turned off.
Now, where were we?
I was going to tell you about an experiment, not an experiment, but an experience that I had with George Bagby, who was a state representative from Paulding County in Dallas, Georgia. While we was having the problems with Georgia Power Company working 12,000 volts, I found out that the states of Oregon and Washington had laws state laws that prohibited working voltage above 2,300 volts phase to ground. And some of my good friends in the labor movement told me that George Bagby was the best state representative, labor representative in the state legislature. So I got my local union to go on record to donate him $500 for campaign contributions, and me and the president of the local union, Mr. Paul Champion, went to visit with him one night and present him with that check to get him to try to get some legislation passed on working 12,000 votes in the state legislature. And he took that $500, and we never did get any legislation on gloving 12,000 votes. And I learned through the grapevine later on that he was on a retainer fee for the Georgia Power Company.
Son of a gun. Did you ever meet a politician who you thought was worth anything?
Well, I have some reservations about that. I cannot qualify that statement.
Okay.
But there should be a way. We, the people of this country, should have a way of knowing every damn politician is on a retainer fee for anybody. And every lawyer, it ought to be public information. It ought to be a way to get it. But how you going to get those legislators to pass a law like that?
Yeah, that'll happen. Was there other stuff that you were going to mention about the IBEW before we get on to the state?
Let me.
Well, you can tell me some of the proud moments of the IBEW's history, and also some of the technical aspects. Why don't you tell me a few of those for the tape? For instance, the question of dues.
Okay. When I was president of the local union, I had been advocating to the business manager, Mr. Arnold Kennedy, that we should increase our dues so we could pay off our debts and have some money to hire lawyers when we need to and represent our members like we need to. And he wouldn't agree to do that because he was scared to get him defeated if he increased the dues. That one of the first things I did when I was elected business manager was point out to the members of our local union that we was affiliated with the Atlanta Labor Council and Atlanta Building Trades, and we was affiliated with the Southeastern System Council, and we was affiliated with the Georgia Electric Workers Association, and we was affiliated with the Georgia State AFL-CIO, all of whom we were shortchanging on our per capita tax. We wasn't paying full per capita to none of them. The only one that was getting full per capita was our International in Washington. And that was like I told a business manager at that time, that it was like a union member coming up and saying, I'll just pay part of my dues this month. I didn't feel that was right. And so the first thing I did was increase the dues so we could pay full per capita to everybody we was affiliated with. And I took our organization out of the building trades because we was not a building trades union, didn't have any business being affiliated with them to start with. Only reason we was affiliated with them so Arnold Kenny could be secretary of that organization.
What do the members think about the dues?
Well, the membership supported me 100%. Well, not 100%, but the dues increase passed overwhelmingly when I explained the need, and we've become 100% affiliated with everybody we was affiliated with, paying our full per capita to all of them.
It's been a union with a local with a very proud history. Would you just tell me a little about some of these fine points of the local?
Local 84 was chartered on July the 24th, 1899, and is the sixth oldest local union in the Brotherhood at this time, because every local between 1 and 84 has gone defunct, and the charter has been reissued at a later date, which makes local union 84 the sixth oldest local union in the Brotherhood, will continue standing without a blemish on the charter. I want to say that I had the good fortune of visiting with the last living charter member of Local 84, an old gentleman by the name of Jerome Foster, and his wife several times before he passed away. And he was one of the charter members of Local 84. Local 84 celebrated its centennial anniversary on July the 24th, in 1999. I also want to get in the record about a gentleman named, or brother named Bill Pollard, who was business manager, financial secretary of Local 84, and never heard anything but good praises about the fine job he did representing members of that organization. I was told that he come to Atlanta selling bits for Irwin Bit Company, the kind of bits that they bored holes in power poles and telephone poles with.
And then there was the strike that began in 31.
Yeah, I worked with some of those old men that went through that strike, and I can't recall if I've already put this on the tape. If I have, just leave that part out. But a bunch of the men went to union meeting one night and voted to go on strike without giving proper notice to everybody else. And for that reason, the strike wasn't supported very good. There's some of them worked the strike and scabbed the job. But a lot of those good old men that stuck that strike out lost their homes and their automobiles, and some of them lost their wives. And the only reason the strike was ever settled was in December of 1935, and I'm old enough to remember it. It snowed and it sleeted and it snowed and sleeted, and every trolley line in the city of Atlanta, the streetcar lines, was down in the streets. Trees was all over the streets. Atlantic Ice and Coal Company was a big company that had a lot of trucks at that time, and Georgia Power Company rented every one of them and bought all the axes and saws from hardware stores all over town and hired everybody they could hire to clean up the streets and rebuild the power system. And they had to hurt somebody to climb up their poles.
Well, who says God's not on labor's side? But there were some problems with the Constitution you were mentioning.
Yes, under the IBE Levy Constitution, when you're at International Convention electing vice presidents and International Executive Council members, you vote a county unit system vote. Each local union has got one vote in each one of those elections. And if you've got 20 members in a local union or 500 members in a local union, you still just got one vote. That's equal to what we used to call a county unit system in the state of Georgia in electing state officials. And in my opinion, it's in violation of the laws of this land. How can you conduct a secret ballot among 10 delegates trying to determine how you're going to vote one vote? If there's a way to do it, I've never seen it done. I've been at conventions with numerous delegates, and it's always presents a problem because everybody's got to declare for which candidate they're for, and everybody knows who's supporting who, and that's not a secret ballot.
Mm-hmm.
But that perpetuates them people that's in office.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
That's what it's for. And the International has also got the right to set in charters and remove charters and combine local unions. And in my case, in Local 84 in Atlanta, one time there were 7 local unions on the property of the Georgia Power Company. But because there was utility local unions, and they maybe could outvote some of the inside local unions, they merged them all into one, eliminating 5 of the utility local unions.
Huh. That's very interesting. When was that?
It was between the time I was removed from office in '65 and when I went back to work for them in '83.
Okay. Yeah, you go back and triumph in '83, don't you?
Yeah.
But let's do the state AFL-CIO first.
Okay.
Okay? Now tell me about it. Well, let's state for the record what your position was, what your job was, and then tell me about your job, okay?
I attended the state AFL-CIO convention in Savannah, Georgia as a delegate from District Council 14, ASME, American Federation of State County Municipal Employees, and successfully ran for secretary of the state AFL-CIO against John Wright of the Communication Workers Union. And my job as secretary of the state AFL-CIO was to carry out the directives of the convention. Number one, keep up with all the correspondence, keep the executive officers informed of what all the activities was going on and things that was coming up. And shortly after I was in office, Jim Moore, the president of the state AFL,
with J.W. Giles.
Jim Moore and I went over to the Capitol. He was going to introduce me around to some of the state officials, and we met Secretary of State Ben Fortson and Jim Giles, the highway commissioner, and some of the state senators and representatives that happened to be there that day. On the way back to the office, he informed me that he was going to fire the secretary of the office, Mrs. Sarah Butler. I said, I beg your pardon, you're not going to fire Ms. Butler because she works for me. I'm the secretary. You're the president. I said, you had 2 years, you could have fired her when you were secretary. But I said, I'm the secretary now. She works for me and you're not firing her. So we got started off on the wrong foot, and in my opinion, Mr. Jim Moore didn't do anything for the labor movement as long as I knew him.
Huh.
He come to the office at 10, 11 o'clock in the morning and look at the newspaper and get his hat about 12 and go home until 1:30, 2 o'clock and come back and maybe look at his mail and throw it in the garbage and get his hat and go home. And I did his job and my job for 2 years, and I decided he had to go, I had to go, and I got beat by 4 votes on the recount.
Killer. All right, now what did you do after that?
Sarah Butler never did get fired, by the way.
Hey, she's OPEIU.
Yeah.
They would have thrown up a picket line.
Right. She was a fine lady. and I documented, I gave everything that happened between me and Jim Moore, I put in writing and signed it and have it as an affidavit in case something happened to me for her protection.
Is she still alive?
I talked to her the other day.
Oh, yeah.
She lives up close to Gainesville.
Okay. I'll go to her and ask for the true scoop on you. Watch out.
Do.
Now, Mr. Giles, what did you do after the state AFL-CIO, after that election?
And one of the first things I did something that Jim Moore had been under instructions for 6 years by the convention. I introduced a resolution at the convention about 6 years before that, instructing the secretary to establish a pension program and an annuity plan with the Union Labor Life Insurance Company for the officers and the secretary of the state AFL-CIO, the office secretary. Jim Moore was under direction of the convention for 6 years and sat on his ass and didn't do it. And as soon as I was elected, I got it adopted, put it into effect. I never did enjoy none of the benefits, but I'm proud to say that I got it put in effect anyway.
Did you then, or are we getting up to when you go back to IBEW Local 84? Or can you add some stuff about the state AFL-CIO?
Well, as secretary of the state AFL-CIO, when we'd have our executive board meetings, I would be thorough in trying to keep the officers informed, and they hadn't been accustomed to that. They had been accustomed to meeting and enjoying the expenses being paid by the state AFL-CIO and the meals being paid, and they wanted short meetings so they could get to the happy hours. And they didn't like me being so thorough with keeping them informed of what was going on. And while I was secretary of the state AFL-CIO, I wrote to every national and international union and advised them how many members of their local unions, how many of their local unions was affiliated and how many members they was paying on, and asked them if they wasn't paying on full membership to use their influence to get the local union to pay their full per capita like they were supposed to. You can be sure I caught hell from some of the local union representatives for doing that. But I also got some local unions paying full per capita while I was at it.
Was it just a standard operating procedure before not to pay your full per capita?
Everybody just always done like they wanted to. Just pay on token membership. And get up there and run their mouth like they was, paying on their full membership.
Was there anyone among the state AFL-CIO officers and general leaders who you look back and say, that was a good person to work with at that time?
Yeah, Morgan Bowen, local union 1316 in Macon, Georgia, is one of the finest men I ever worked with. And Faye Knight with the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union from Americus, Georgia, was a fine lady and a good union rep. And I want to get in the record that Mrs. Maud Ireland from the International Lady Garment Workers Union, I think that's who she represented. And I think she was employed by Carhartt Overall Company on Whitehall Street. Was one of the finest ladies I ever met, and she was a true trade unionist. And William A. Bill Setti from the Painters Local Union, who was business manager of the building trades. Bill was from Savannah, Georgia, and his craft was painting the intricate fixtures in the ceilings of elaborate buildings like the old what's that old hotel out there on Whitehall? I mean on West Peachtree Street.
Not the Grady.
No.
No, that was Peachtree. No, it's gone.
West, Biltmore.
Oh, okay.
a lot of the heads of figurines, and he lay on his back on a scaffold and painted those sort of things. He was
like
a real,
Michelangelo.
yeah, he was a real craftsman and a true trade unionist, and he was from Savannah, Georgia. He was a fine old gentleman.
When you say true trade unionist, what in your mind does that entail?
True trade unionist is a man that believes in a honest day's work for honest day's pay, and stands up for his members and the other members of the trade union movement, all crafts and trade.
Okay. Well, when did you leave the state AFL-CIO?
I served one term, 2 years, and I was defeated. To give you an example of how low down Jim Moore was, at the convention where I ran against him and was defeated as secretary of the state AFL-CIO, I set up everything at the convention. Everything that was, all of the arrangements made for the convention, logistically, everything. And I know for a fact, prior to the meeting, I went in the convention hall and the flags was in place as it was supposed to be. But he had some of his cronies from the Carpenters Union, I learned later, to move the flag. And he turned to me when the convention was called to order and said, "Where's the flag, Mr. Secretary? That's your job to see that the flag is in here. But since you hadn't got one in here, I got one here on my lapel and y'all can salute it." The old son of a bitch.
He really was. What a son of a gun. Being in the state AFL-CIO, though, gave you a unique chance to see what was going on across the state. Just limiting it to ASME and IBEW locals, were there any that were particularly strong and weak during that period?
The strongest local unions in the state of Georgia was in Rome, Georgia,
Oh, yeah? Okay.
in my opinion.
Why was that?
Mr. Al Worthington of the International Union of Electrical Workers and a gentleman named Tate, who was from the pulp and sulfite workers union at that time before they merged with the paper workers, was two of the leaders in that area. In fact, Tate ran with me when I was running for president. He was running for my old job as secretary. And he ran a good race too. We just barely got beat.
So Rome, Georgia, huh? That's very interesting. Did they send a labor guy to the state legislature? Maybe I can make it a broader question. Were there ever any guys who really were good for labor in the state legislature?
Well, the IBEW had a member that was a member of the state legislature, a guy named Joe Battle from Savannah, Georgia, who was a member of the paper workers local union in Savannah. And he ran on a Republican ticket. And as secretary of the state AFL-CIO, I was instrumental in getting a minimum wage law passed in the state of Georgia. It's on the books, but there wasn't ever any enabling legislation to put any money there to enforce it. And Joe Battle was the prime sponsor of the bill, and he worked out the differences in the Joint Conference Committee between the House and Senate to get the bill passed.
Why do you think a minimum wage is important?
Well, at that time, it was needed and still needed today for the ladies that work in housekeeping, and things like that. I can't think of the term that you call domestic workers,
Yeah.
I think. severely needed.
How did you end up, stop me if I'm zooming along too fast, but how did you end up getting back with the IBEW? In 83, is it?
I, we hadn't covered the time I worked for OSHA. I worked for
Oh,
OSHA.
that's right.
I worked for OSHA for 8 years as a labor liaison.
Okay, yeah. Tell me about that.
Well, the gentleman that interviewed me for that job was out of the Boilermakers Union. And the undersecretary for labor at that time over OSHA was a guy named William Stender, who was also a Boilermaker by trade from Seattle, Washington. And he was one of Scoop Jackson's friends. And Scoop Jackson made him undersecretary. And I can't remember the gentleman's name that come down from Washington, from the Boilermakers, and interviewed me for the job. But he took me over to the regional director's office, and we met with the regional director, and they decided to hire me in that capacity as a labor liaison. At that time, my job was set up to report directly to the regional director. And the regional director come out of the Maritime Union, and he had a friend that come out of Maritime that was also in that same office at a lower grade. He was a GS-13. I went to work as a GS-12 labor liaison. And the regional director wanted to make Pat Honey over the GS-14 over the training section. In order to do that, he had to give him some bodies, and I was one of the bodies that he gave to Pat Honey. And Pat Honey was a fine old gentleman from New Jersey, and I got along fine as long as he was there. But when he left, a young pipsqueak to come up in the office end of the business, it wasn't a safety professional by trade. His daddy had worked for the government at one of the air bases down in Florida, and he worked for the government, and he long enough to know how to make the system work. And a fellow by the name of Alan Macmillan, and he got over the training section, and my life became miserable after that. After he used me a little bit until he got acquainted with all of the union representatives from the Washington level, the safety people for the building trades and the safety people for the auto workers, and some more people that I got him acquainted with. And after he got acquainted with them, he didn't need me anymore. He was ready to get rid of me. I started cutting deals, and he wound up being a regional administrator of OSHA. And for the record, I want people to know why OSHA didn't ever get off the ground like it was supposed to represent the interests of the working people. When the law was enacted, the Congress didn't have the time to sit down and adopt every safety standard that had to be enacted to protect working people, so they empowered the Secretary of Labor to promulgate the rules and regulations. And when the Williams-Steiger Act was passed, all of these agencies in the federal government already had safety people working in those agencies. And all of them moved into OSHA and took over all of the key positions in OSHA. And all of them immediately started building their empires and hiring as many warm bodies as they could get to justify whatever they wanted to do. So then the law also made provisions for states to go into the safety business, provided they'd furnish so much of the money. And in Region 4 that I represented, the states of North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky had state plans. And it was part of my responsibility to monitor some of their activities. And in North Carolina, they had an old area director by the name of Haskins that didn't like labor and didn't like labor unions. And there was provisions in there's provisions in the state plan for anybody that didn't think the employer was doing right, they could file complaints. And Mr. Haskins didn't think they should have that right, so he wouldn't allow it. But I made arrangements to see that he had to do it.
How'd you do that?
Through the regional director.
Okay. Were the state plans pretty much the same, or did you have to deal with a lot of differences?
They had to be as good as or better.
Okay.
That's the way it was set up.
Were they ever better?
No. The California may have been. May have been.
What was the hardest part of your job with OSHA?
Adapting to their new procedures day in and day out, and
Were you glad to get rid of a government job?
I quit that job.
Yeah.
When I went with OSHA, they was doing about 5 inspections a week per compliance officer on average. When I left there, they was doing between 1 and 1.5. Reason being documentation and taking photographs and all of that. And as soon as the legal department for the Department of Labor got a lawyer halfway trained to do a good job, some company would hire him away from OSHA. And I think there was a conspiracy with the companies to do that so that OSHA wouldn't have any competent lawyers. Mm-hmm. And when OSHA was first enacted, I have reasons to believe, I can't qualify this, but I have reasons to believe that some of the companies got some of their key people to take jobs with OSHA, and they deliberately went out and harassed the mom and pop operations and issued citations when they should have been at some hazardous workplaces inspecting them instead of the mom and pop operations. Mm-hmm. And it brought about a lot of adverse publicity for OSHA.
Certainly historical precedents. That going back to Teddy Roosevelt's day. So you quit OSHA, and then where'd you go?
Went back and worked with my tools for about 6 months at Plant Harley Branch as an inside electrician. Mm-hmm. And then I ran my business manager, Clyde Connell, the man who had been kind enough to give me a job for 2 years as assistant business manager. In the last election before I ran against him, he was almost defeated by just a few votes. And I felt sure he was going to be defeated that time. And I felt like I was the best qualified man for the job. Mm-hmm. And I ran for the job and got elected. And I fought the leadership of the executive board for 2 years and got defeated again by a small margin. Very low turnout. We had a referendum, mail ballot, and we had over 5,000 members, and the turnout was very small. I don't remember what it was, but
No
it
doubt,
was
so it was
pitiful.
close.
Coming this out,
Okay.
in the last term of Clyde Connor's administration, they had a strike, and there was a few of the members that scabbed a job. And there was some of those people that tried to join the local union after it was over with. And even when the international representative would be present in the executive board meeting, they would vote those people down. And not only them, but some other people. I never have been able to understand that. People standing in line to join the union, they wouldn't let them in. I didn't agree with that. I don't agree with it today. Some people have always been in what turned out.
Okay. Well, okay. Let me ask when you finally retired.
I
Are you retired?
yes, after I was defeated.
Actually, before you retired.
Yeah, last time I was business manager of the local union, the vice president of Georgia Power Company over construction, Mr. Jack Lawrence, called me one day and wanted to know if I could furnish him 200 or 300 people for a year or two. Said they had a lot of work needed to be done, but they didn't want to hire a bunch of people for that short term. I said, you give us the work, we'll find the people. And we did. Dillard Smith Construction Company did most of that construction. Local Union 84 collected 2% assessment off all of it. And the man that defeated me for my job as business manager, Mr. Doyle Howard, his brother worked for my local union during that period of time as a non-union member. And after his boss, Clyde Connor, got elected, Doyle Howard was working for him as an assistant. After his boss, Clyde Connor, got defeated, Doyle Howard's brother asked the local union to reimburse him all the assessments he had paid during that period of time. I called the International Union and asked them what I should do, and they said, you better pay him. So I cut him a check for all the assessments he'd paid, but I wanted the record to show that Doyle Howard's brother did that. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Anytime. It's kind of nervy. When you were 65, then you retired.
Right.
You also were honored, weren't you, as a labor leader of one of the outstanding labor leaders of our area?
Yes, the
Atlanta Labor Council, was it? Or state? It was the
Workman's Circle.
Yeah. They thought pretty highly of you.
Yes, and I'd like to say, while I was being honored at that ceremony downtown, somebody deliberately messed with the PA system and the tapes that they did on what I had to say and remarks that I had to make wasn't audible to the people present there that night. Because the PA system, I'm confident, was deliberately tampered with.
Who do you think did that?
I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't somebody from member 613, because Harry Bexley's never has been honored, and they've always been jealous about that.
I see. Okay. Let me just ask, before I ask you something a little more philosophical, what do you do now that you're so-called retired?
I try to stay active. I've got plenty to do. I got a new house and trying to get some grass to grow in the yard. Trying to have a garden.
Mm-hmm. Got your greens in already?
Yeah.
Now let me ask this. If you had a podium, you're up on a stage and you can say anything you want to an auditorium full of young union members, what would you tell them?
I tell them to be active and participate in the activities of the organization.
Okay.
See that it's run right. See that people abide by the rules and regulations. See that they're spending money right, and see that they're made to account for their money. The first thing I did when I was elected business manager, one of the first things I did was the night I was installed, I made a motion that the local union authorized me to hire an auditor to audit the auditor, and under the supervision of someone from our international office, because I was inheriting a set of books that had been kept by the same person for 16 years, and there was some irregularities there. And I had a clear cutoff date. And that's something nobody's ever accused me of. I've been accused, and rightfully so, of drinking and chasing women, but I ain't never been accused of misusing nobody's money.
But they always go after the money first. It's the one thing you always get charged with, isn't it? That's your advice to these young people who are now in a labor movement, that you would assess how. Where do you think the labor movement is going? And should it go in a different direction or keep on?
Well, the political mood of the average person in this country today seems to be to elect more and more Republicans, and you can bet that there's going to be more and more anti-labor laws. It's going to be more difficult for the unions to get any kind of favorable rulings from NLRB. We hadn't had any decent rulings out of NLRB for 20 years. And unless and until the people get way down and out, like we was after the Big Depression, they're not going to see the need for affiliating with unions and making the unions stronger. That's hard to look at it like that, but that's probably the way it's going to go.
What should the labor leaders of today be doing?
They should be about tending to the business and representing the people, and giving an account of their activities.
Accountability, huh?
And encouraging people to be active in politics and support people that would do the right by organized labor. Some of the problems that organized labor's got, they've brought on themselves, or we've brought on ourselves. But we don't deserve the kind of treatment we've been getting.
Mr. Giles, would you say it's been a good life for you?
It's been a good life. I wouldn't change a thing if I had it to do over.
It's a good place to end. Let me just ask you about Joe Jacobs, who's one of the shovers behind this whole project.
Well, Joe Jacobs has been a friend to me all the time that I was active in the labor movement. He's given me a lot of free advice against his better judgment about how to look after my business as a labor representative. And I will always be eternally grateful to one of the finest men that I've known, Mr. Joe Jacobs.